Fellow Gazzeted, it is public knowledge that ZANU-PF has been planning to amend the constitution to allow President Mnangagwa to remain in office. This has never been a secret. The only question was, when would this happen? However, recent events have caught many people by surprise. A few days ago, the Zimbabwean government approved proposals to amend the constitution in ways that would significantly change how Zimbabwe is governed. This is no longer just about extending President Mnangagwa's term. ZANU-PF is now preparing to restructure the entire system of government. So whether you support or oppose these proposals, one thing is very clear. If these proposals are approved, then Zimbabwe as we know it will fundamentally change. And as I react to these proposals, several questions arise. What will happen after 2030? Will ED step down, or is this part of a broader strategy to remain in office indefinitely? There is also the proposed change in wording regarding the role of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, from upholding the constitution to acting in accordance with the constitution. What is the legal and practical difference between those two phrases? And ladies and gentlemen, is it not ironic that some of the people who in 2017 either benefited from or relied on the ZDF's constitutional mandate to uphold the constitution now seem uncomfortable with that wording? Is that not hypocrisy? Well, fellow Gazzeted, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, vasinamalites, varikudya rice, nevasinama rice. Welcome to the special report. As I said in my introduction, the Zimbabwean government, through the Minister of Justice, recently announced that a cabinet has approved proposals to amend the constitution in ways we have not seen in recent history. In fact, I can go insofar as saying that these proposals are the most far-reaching since 1987, when Zimbabwe abolished the position of Prime Minister. What ZANU-PF is proposing is not a minor or routine constitutional amendment. It amounts to a fundamental restructuring of the state. But let us break it down slowly and clearly. I'm sure we all know that Zimbabwe currently uses a presidential system of government. We have had this system for 39 years. Under this system, the president is both head of state and head of government, and also commander-in-chief of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces. I'm sure if you're Zimbabwean and you watch the ZBC, then you hear this all the time. However, it is important to understand that this was not always the case. The office of a president, who is both head of state and head of government, began in 1987. Before that, the president of Zimbabwe was only the head of state, not the head of government. From 1980 to 1987, leadership of Zimbabwe was divided into two separate roles: the role of head of state and the role of head of government. The role of head of state was held by a ceremonial president, Kenan Banana. The role of head of government was held by an executive prime minister, Robert Mugabe. As prime minister, Mugabe had executive authority and effectively was the one running the country. In 1987, These two positions, these two roles of head of state and head of government, were merged into one office known as the executive presidency. That is the office which exists today. That means the Zimbabwean president is an executive president. Now, Section 92 of the Zimbabwean Constitution clearly says that the election of the president must take place at the same time as the election of members of parliament and councillors. So when you go to vote, you are voting for your MP, your councillor, and also your president. 3 separate elections combined into one general election. That is why we call it a harmonized election. It was not always like this, you know. From 1995 to 2005, presidential elections were held separately from parliamentary elections. This was because the presidential term was 6 years at the time. Of course, the law was then changed, reducing the presidential term to 5 years and aligning it with parliament and local government. And that change led to what we now call harmonized elections. Now let's take a look at what the ZANU-PF government is proposing. It wants to get rid of our current presidential system and replace it with a parliamentary system, similar to the government system of South Africa. What this means is that if what is being proposed is passed, then Zimbabwe will no longer do presidential elections. Instead, the president would now be elected by parliament, similar to what happens in South Africa. However, the key difference would be the actual electoral framework, because in South Africa, members of parliament are chosen through a proportional representation system. When people go to vote in South Africa, they vote for a political party, and seats in parliament are then shared based on how many votes each party gets. In Zimbabwe, however, MPs are elected directly in their constituencies using a first-past-the-post system. This means the candidate with the highest number of votes in a constituency wins the seat, even if they do not get more than 50% of the total votes. That is the difference. But the similarity would be how the president is elected. As I said, the president would now be elected by parliament after a general election. In practice, this means the president would come from a party that has a parliamentary majority. If no party wins a majority, then parties can form coalitions in order to elect a president of their choice. This is similar to what happened in South Africa when the ANC lost its parliamentary majority and had to rely on coalition arrangements. Now let's take a look at how the president would actually get elected in parliament. The proposal is that there would be a joint sitting of parliament. Remember, the Zimbabwean parliament is made up of 2 houses, a Senate and the House of Assembly. So after a general election, these 2 houses of parliament would convene a joint sitting. In other words, gather in one house, in one room, to elect the president. The proposal is that a candidate would need to get more than half of the total votes. If no one gets more than 50%, then there would be a runoff between the top 2 candidates. This election would be presided over by the Chief Justice, just like in South Africa. That's how the Zimbabwean president would now be elected. The other constitutional change they are proposing is regarding term limits. They want to lengthen the presidential term from the current 5 years to 7 years in order to allow President Mnangagwa to remain in office until 2030. For the benefit of those who don't know, the Zimbabwean constitution says a president can only do 2 terms. This is in Section 91. And for clarity, Section 95 says 1 term is 5 years. That means a president in Zimbabwe can only do a maximum of 10 years. So therefore, if they amend Section 95 to increase the presidential term from the current 5 years to 7 years, while Section 91 remains unchanged, then this would mean that a Zimbabwean president would now serve a maximum of 14 years if elected 2 times. But more importantly, it's not just the president who would be getting 7 years. Parliament and local government would also get the same. That basically means all the people who were elected in the 2023 harmonized elections would get an extension of 2 years. In simple terms, if this proposal is successful, there won't be any elections in 2028. The next elections would be in 2030. ZANU-PF wants to do all this without a referendum. But we will get to this later. For now, let's take a look at one of the most sensitive proposals being proposed by the ZANU-PF government. They want to amend the wording in Section 212. This section deals with the Zimbabwe Defense Forces. Currently, the Constitution says the Zimbabwe Defense Forces must protect Zimbabwe and uphold the Constitution. But now, the Zimbabwean government wants to delete that statement which says uphold the Constitution. They want to replace it with in accordance with the Constitution. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the difference is not cosmetic. To uphold the Constitution suggests an active duty to defend and protect a constitutional order. Saying in accordance with the Constitution suggests compliance while carrying out assigned duties. We all know that in 2017, the Zimbabwean military used Section 212 to justify the coup. It became a constitutionally abiding coup, a legal coup, and not a coup. They said they were upholding and defending the Constitution by targeting criminals that were surrounding the president. Those who are in favor of the amendment will argue that this proposal actually clarifies roles and prevents future military entanglements in politics. But of course, that argument is mischievously shallow and hollow. But I'm not worried about its shallowness and hollowness. I'm more worried about its hypocrisy. I mean, is it not ironic that a clause invoked during the 2017 coup is now being narrowed after its political usefulness has passed? They used this clause when it was convenient for them. Now that they want to entrench power, they are thinking of removing it. Of course, the 2017 coup was carried out by soldiers, but you would be a fool to think that civilians were not involved. Only recently, the Minister of Justice, Ziyambi, revealed some finer details about the 2017 coup that were hitherto unknown to the public. We got to know for the first time that the 2017 coup was bankrolled by Kudakwashe Tagwirei. So whether one calls it reform or hypocrisy depends on a political perspective. But the timing and history cannot be ignored. Another proposed change is the elections framework. They are proposing the creation of a new commission called the Zimbabwe Electoral Delimitation Commission. This body would now be responsible for drawing electoral boundaries in Zimbabwe. Currently, this is a function of ZEC. They are also thinking about transferring the voters' roll and voter registration from ZEC to the Registrar General, taking us back to the days of Tobayiwa Mudede. But in reality, it doesn't really make much of a difference which commission controls what, for as long as the system remains the same. Remember, what is wrong with Zimbabwean elections is not necessarily ZEC. It's the system behind ZEC. They are also proposing to amend Section 180 to remove current provisions that require public interviews for judges. Public interviews allow citizens to see who is being appointed and assess their competence and independence. Removing that requirement reduces public scrutiny. It centralizes this process and limits visibility. The other constitutional proposal is to allow traditional leaders, chiefs, to participate in politics. Now, let's be very clear on this. Traditional leaders are already involved in politics in support of ZANU-PF. This is a well-known fact. There is nothing new or groundbreaking about this particular proposal. If anything, this would just be a formalization of reality. The one traditional leader who stood up against ZANU-PF, Chief Ndiweni of Ntabazinduna, was removed simply for criticizing government and aligning himself with the opposition. Of course, they created stories against him and even exploited family differences for the express purpose of sending a clear message. Any traditional leader that rises up against ZANU-PF will go the same way. The self-proclaimed Munumutapa will fire you. So, the proposed constitutional changes by ZANU-PF can be summarized as follows: longer terms, fewer elections, a president getting elected by parliament instead of being elected by voters, more presidential appointments in the Senate, restructuring of election management, reduced transparency in judicial appointments, and a narrowed military constitutional mandate. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a complete redesign of the state. But hey, let's be honest. The idea of a president who gets elected by parliament is not really a bad idea at all. If anything, it makes the president less of a demigod. Well, at least in principle. Presidents who get elected by parliament are much easier to remove. Such presidents function like prime ministers. In fact, I call them presidential prime ministers. Other people call them glorified prime ministers, in the sense that it's more like a prime minister who also plays the role of a head of state. In a party like ZANU-PF, which has a strong history of factionalism, it is not unthinkable for a group of MPs to turn against their own president. We have seen this before. Bora Msango happened in 2008. A president chosen by parliament depends on MPs to stay in power. If he loses support inside his own party, he can be removed by a vote of no confidence without waiting for a national election. That creates pressure from within rather than relying on pressure from the opposition. It also means the president must keep MPs happy. He must keep MPs on his side, not just the public. In this context, internal rebellion becomes a real threat. Factionalism could potentially lead to the actual removal of the president. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, we must not live in dreamland. Let's wake up and smell the Zimbo coffee, or rather, Tanganda tea. This is Zimbabwe, not South Africa. This is ZANU-PF, not the ANC. This is Mnangagwa, not Ramaphosa. Zimbabwe is just different. In theory, yes, a president elected by parliament would be answerable to parliament. But in reality, that may not happen in Zimbabwe. A parliamentary system only works as intended if MPs can act independently when necessary. But if everyone simply follows party orders, then nothing changes. If MPs simply get told when to do and how to do what to do, then nothing changes. If MPs continue receiving and accepting bribes like $40,000 loans or residential stands, then nothing changes. And if MPs represent their parties in parliament on the basis of unquestionable loyalty to their party leadership, then such MPs will feel indebted to their leaders. And if MPs feel indebted, they will not act independently when necessary. And if they don't act independently when necessary, then nothing changes. So, in that context, you simply replace one system with another that still concentrates power. The highest bidder could become president. Loyalty shifts from principle to power and money. Actually, in this context, loyalty is not shifting at all. It remains where it has always been, on power and money. Of course, under a parliamentary system, if the opposition won a majority in parliament, it would also be able to choose a president of its choice. However, the opposition in Zimbabwe has generally performed poorly in parliamentary elections. ZANU-PF has usually dominated parliament, except in 2000 and most importantly, 2008. Under Mnangagwa, ZANU-PF has remained dominant in parliament. Well, at least according to the figures released by ZEC. Disputed as they are. It is mainly in presidential elections that Mnangagwa's ZANU-PF has won very narrow victories. In 2018, he got 50.8%. In 2023, which is the last election, he got 52.6%. That means in both elections, almost half of the people who voted did not believe that President Mnangagwa is the right man to lead Zimbabwe. This makes one wonder why he's so hell-bent on staying in office until 2030. Clearly, the nation is divided on whether they want ED to be president, at least going by the results of the last two elections, disputed as they are. Could this be the reason why they are trying to avoid the referendum route? Well, that brings us to another question. Would Mnangagwa be allowed to run again after 2030 under this new system that is being proposed? Well, the current proposals are about changing the presidential term together with parliament and local government from the current 5 years to 7 years. There is currently nothing in the proposals that removes the current two-term limit. Section 91 clearly says that a Zimbabwean president can only serve a maximum of 2 terms. So, if they lengthen the presidential term from the current 5 to 7 years, then Mnangagwa's second term would end in 2030 instead of 2028. But before we go any further, that alone is already problematic because the current constitution forbids Mnangagwa from getting a third term. He can only have 2 terms. But ZANU-PF is saying, no, we are not giving Mnangagwa a third term. We are simply lengthening his current term from 5 years to 7 years. Yet the constitution in section 328 says, any amendment to the constitution, the effect of which is to extend the president's stay in power, does not benefit a sitting president. So the issue here is about extending the amount of time President Mnangagwa will stay in office. That's what Section 328, subsection 7 is saying. The question we must ask ourselves is, does adding 2 years to Mnangagwa's current term extend his stay in power? The answer is of course yes. Second question is, what does the Constitution say about extending a president's stay in power? The Constitution says the sitting president does not benefit from that amendment. Keep in mind, amending the Constitution is not illegal. The only issue is, a sitting president does not qualify or benefit from any amendment to the Constitution that lengthens or extends a presidential term. But of course, their argument is that simply adding 2 years on top of Mnangagwa's current term does not require a referendum. They argue that only giving Mnangagwa a third term would require a referendum. Now let's assume that understanding is correct. Then, even by their own admission, Mnangagwa won't be able to remain in office after 2030, unless of course, if they amend the constitution to remove the 2-term limit and also do a second amendment to allow Mnangagwa to benefit from the first amendment. Of course, via the referendum route. But the bigger issue is this. If they can get away with giving Mnangagwa 2 more years without a referendum, then it creates a dangerous precedent. In the future, they could use the same method again. They could amend the constitution in 2030 without a referendum and allow ED to remain in office. Once constitutional protections are bypassed once, it becomes easier to bypass them again. That is why it matters. If ZANU-PF wants ED to remain president, that is their political position. But they cannot bypass constitutional provisions. They must follow the process. So, what to do, ladies and gentlemen? Well, the obvious response would be to go to court. However, here's the problem. Taking ZANU-PF to court on an issue that it is desperately determined to win is largely symbolic. You should assume that they have already anticipated every legal argument that can be raised. Expecting to defeat them purely through litigation is unrealistic. Challenging ZANU-PF in Zimbabwean courts is like arm wrestling a brick wall, suing the devil in the high court of hell. Do you expect to win? When that party really wants something, it rarely shifts because of legal reasoning alone. The only mechanism that has historically moved ZANU-PF is pressure, both internal and external. Legal action alone without a political pressure achieves little. History is very clear. In 1979, at the Lancaster House talks, when Robert Mugabe would not sign the agreement, it took pressure from Samora Machel to convince Mugabe to sign. Remember, at the time, ZANU-ZANLA was based in Mozambique, so Samora carried a lot of weight and influence over Mugabe and ZANU. This is a verifiable historical fact. In 2008, ZANU-PF agreed to share power with the MDC only when it was cornered. The two MDC factions had won more seats than ZANU-PF, and Mugabe's runoff election had been widely condemned internationally. ZANU-PF was at its weakest point since independence. So, with its legitimacy damaged and regional backing strained, it entered a power-sharing arrangement because it had limited options. Again, pressure produced compromise. Today, the opposition is arguably at its weakest since 1995. It has no clear leverage. ZANU-PF does not feel threatened. So without pressure, there is no incentive for ZANU-PF to give concessions. That explains the confidence behind attempts to amend constitutional safeguards without a referendum. Tweets, YouTube videos, and press conferences do not create any material pressure. Only sustained nationwide mass action does. But here's the problem. Mass action in Zimbabwe carries a real risk. In simple terms, people die. Actually, they get killed. That explains why there is widespread public apathy in political matters in Zimbabwe. Many citizens are simply unwilling to endanger themselves over political issues. Calls for demonstrations often fail because people calculate the cost and stay at home. Geza found out the hard way. May his soul rest in peace. The good thing, however, is that opposition figures have taken a stand against the proposed constitutional amendment. We have seen people like Scala, Ngarivome, BT, Monzora, and others doing press conferences, vowing to work together in defending the constitution. What has been pleasing to hear is that almost all of them agree that this can no longer be about big man politics and personalities, and that, more importantly, they must bury their differences for the express purpose of defending the constitution. What is very clear is that the fight must go beyond press conferences and social media outrage. And more importantly, we the people must stop expecting politicians to save us. Maybe you are the savior that you're crying for. But anyway, let's have a conversation in the comment section. What do you think is the way forward? But whatever happens, I'll be here to marinate you with all the details without fear or favor. Because on this platform, we say it as it is. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.